Hello? Is anyone there? I know I heard something.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Turn down your lights, lock your doors, and make sure you're comfortable. Because tonight we're diving into a story that might make you think twice about taking a late night job. Have you ever taken a job just because it paid well and promised absolutely zero human interaction? I know I have. There is something comforting about the idea of working alone while the rest of the world is sleeping. No annoying boss looking over your shoulder, no fake small talk with coworkers, just you, your headphones, and a paycheck. But after hearing what happened to a guy named Sam, you might realize that total solitude isn't always a blessing. Sometimes being completely alone is the best case scenario, because the alternative means you are not actually alone at all. Sam was 24 years old and desperately broke. He needed cash fast to pay off his back rent. So when he saw a job posting online for a night shift janitor paying double the standard hourly rate, he applied immediately. The catch? The job was at St. Jude's General Hospital, a massive 5-story medical facility on the edge of town that had been officially shut down 3 months prior. The city was planning to renovate the building into modern apartments the following year. But until then, they needed someone to keep the place clean, dry, and free of mold or dust buildup. It sounded like the easiest job on earth. Walk through dark, quiet hallways, push a mop, listen to podcasts, and collect a fat paycheck at the end of the week. What could possibly go wrong in an empty hospital, right? Well, trust me. If you think nothing bad happens in abandoned places, you've clearly never worked a 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. shift in a building where thousands of people have died. On his first night, Sam arrived at midnight sharp. The hospital looked terrifying from the outside, towering against the foggy night sky like a giant concrete skeleton. The main entrance glass doors were chained shut, so Sam had to use a small side entrance near the emergency room bay, unlocking it with a heavy brass key given to him by the property manager. As he stepped inside, the heavy metal door slammed shut behind him with an echoing boom that made his heart leap into his throat. He chuckled to himself, feeling a bit silly. It's just an empty building, he told himself. Just old concrete and rusty pipes. He flipped on his flashlight and made his way to the basement janitor's closet. The air inside the hospital was thick, cold, and smelled weirdly like a mixture of old bleach and stale flowers. The main power grid was turned off to save electricity, leaving only a few dim, yellow emergency lights burning in the main corridors. The rest of the building was engulfed in pitch-black shadow. Sam prepped his yellow mop bucket, filled it with hot water and heavy-duty lavender cleaner, grabbed his broom, and popped his earphones in. He started his playlist, threw on an upbeat song, and began scrubbing the long, wide hallway of the ground floor. For the first 2 hours, everything was completely normal. The rhythmic sound of the mop swooshing against the linoleum floor was almost peaceful. Sam even found himself laughing out loud at a podcast, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. He was thinking about how he was going to spend his easy money. Maybe buy a new gaming setup, pay off his landlord, maybe take his girlfriend out to a nice dinner. Life was looking up. But right around 2:30 a.m., the first weird thing happened. Sam was mopping near the old pediatric wing on the second floor. He took off his earphones for a second to drink some water from his thermos. In the sudden silence, he heard a sound. It wasn't a rat, and it wasn't the wind outside. It was a faint, distinct click, followed by a soft, static buzz coming from the wall above him. Sam looked up and realized he was standing right under an old internal intercom speaker, the kind they used in the 80s to call doctors for emergencies. The speaker crackled again. Then a low, distorted voice came through the static. It sounded distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a deep well. It said 2 words, Room 302. Sam froze, his water thermos hanging halfway to his mouth. He blinked, looking around the empty hall. He tried to tell himself it was just cross interference from a passing police radio or a taxi frequency outside. That happens all the time with old wiring, right? You've probably experienced that yourself. If you ever had an old set of computer speakers that picked up random radio stations at night. So Sam took a deep breath, shook his head, and tried to brush it off. He put his earphones back in, turned the volume up, and kept mopping. By 3:15 a.m., he had moved up to the 3rd floor. This was the intensive care unit, where the air felt noticeably colder than the lower floors. Every time Sam breathed out, a tiny cloud of vapor formed in front of his face. He cursed the building managers for turning off the heating system. As he pushed his mop down the center of the hall, he noticed something strange on the floor ahead of him. The floor he was about to clean wasn't dry and dusty like the rest of the building. It was wet. Sam stopped. He shone his flashlight down at the floor. Leading down the long, narrow corridor was a line of wet footprints. They weren't shoe prints. They were barefoot tracks, dripping with wet, murky liquid, as if someone had just walked out of a bath and trod down the hallway. The footprints started right in front of room 302. Now, if you were in Sam's shoes right now, what would you do? I don't know about you, but I would have dropped that mop, sprinted down the emergency stairs, smashed through the glass doors, and never looked back. But Sam was stubborn, and he really, really needed that money. He convinced himself that a homeless person must have snuck into the building to get out of the cold. That made logical sense. It was a practical explanation. "Hey!" Sam shouted, his voice quavering slightly as it bounced off the walls. "Is anyone there? Look, I don't want any trouble, but this is private property. You need to leave before I call the cops." Silence. The only response was the steady drip, drip, drip of a leaking pipe somewhere down the hall. Sam took a deep breath, gripped his mop handle like a baseball bat, and slowly walked toward room 302. The wet footprints led straight through the doorway and vanished into the darkness inside. Shaking, Sam raised his flashlight and pointed the beam of light into the room. The room was completely stripped down. No medical machinery, no curtains, no floor stands. Just an old, rusted metal bed frame sitting in the center of the room. Sitting on the edge of that bed frame was a figure. Sam's breath caught in his throat. The flashlight beam trembled violently in his hand. The figure was wearing a faded, pale yellow hospital gown. Its back was turned to Sam, hunched over, with long, matted dark hair falling over its shoulders. It was completely still, not even breathing. "Sir?" Sam whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Miss, you can't be in here." Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the figure began to turn its head. Not its shoulders, just its neck, twisting at an unnatural, sickening angle that no human body should be able to manage. Bones popped and cracked in the silence like dry twigs snapping underfoot. Sam couldn't move. His legs felt like lead weights poured into concrete. Before the head could turn far enough for Sam to see its face, the overhead emergency light in the room exploded in a shower of sparks. Total dark fell over the room. Sam screamed. He threw his flashlight, turned around, and ran for his absolute life. He didn't care about his mop, his bucket, or his paycheck anymore. He just wanted to get out of that nightmare building. He sprinted down the long 3rd-floor corridor, his sneakers squeaking wildly against the damp floor. He reached the heavy fire exit doors at the end of the hall, grabbed the metal push bar, and slammed his weight against it. It didn't budge. The door was stuck. Come on, open!" Sam yelled, frantically hitting the bar with his palms. He looked back over his shoulder. At the far end of the hallway, illuminated only by the faint glow of an exit sign, a dark silhouette emerged from room 302. It wasn't walking. It was moving with an unnatural, jerky, broken rhythm, dragging its feet across the floor. Drag, step, and with every step it took, the wet sound of sloshing water filled the corridor. Panicking, Sam abandoned the door and sprinted toward the main elevator bank in the middle of the floor. He smashed his thumb against the down button repeatedly. In normal abandoned buildings, elevators don't work. But to Sam's horror and temporary relief, The mechanical bell chimed. Ding! The heavy silver doors slid open. Sam scrambled inside and pressed the button for the ground floor a dozen times. Just as the elevator doors began to close, a pale, bone-thin hand slammed into the gap between the doors, forcing them back open. Sam let out a primal shriek and threw a punch with all the strength he had left. His fist hit nothing but cold air, but the sudden movement startled whatever was outside, just enough for the doors to slide shut completely. The elevator lurched, mechanism groaning as it descended into the shaft. Sam slumped against the back wall of the elevator, gasping for air, tears streaming down his face. His whole body was shaking out of control. He watched the glowing red floor indicator light count down. 3, 2, 1. Ding! The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Sam didn't hesitate. He burst out of the elevator and made a mad dash for the side door near the ER bay. He fished his keys out of his pocket with trembling fingers, jammed the key into the lock, turned it through the door open, and hurled himself out into the cool night air. He fell hard onto the wet asphalt of the parking lot, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, ran to his old sedan, got inside, locked all the doors, and slammed his foot on the gas pedal, burning rubber as he tore out of the parking lot. He drove straight to a 24-hour diner 3 miles away, parked in the brightly lit lot, and sat there shaking until the sun came up. The next morning, Sam went to the property manager's office to drop off the key and quit. He walked into the office, pale as a sheet, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. The property manager, an older man named Mr. Henderson, looked up from his desk in surprise. "Sam, what are you doing here so early?" Mr. Henderson asked. "Is everything all right with the building?" Sam threw the brass key onto the desk. "I quit," Sam said, his voice raw. "You can keep the money for last night. I'm never going back into that building. You should have told me there were squatters or crazy people living in there. There was a woman on the 3rd floor. Mr. Henderson frowned, looking genuinely confused. "What are you talking about, son? That building has been completely sealed off. Security sweeps it every week. Nobody can get in." "I saw her," Sam yelled, losing his composure. "She was in room 302. She walked toward me, her neck twisted. Mr. Henderson's face suddenly turned dead white. The annoyance on his face vanished, replaced by an expression of pure dread. He sat back in his chair, staring at Sam as if he were looking at a ghost. "Son," Mr. Henderson said softly, his voice trembling slightly. Room 302 was the ICU unit for the old isolation ward. 5 years ago, during the flood, the backup generators on the lower level failed. A patient in room 302, a young woman, drowned in her bed before the rescue team could reach her. The 3rd floor was permanently closed after that. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, looking Sam straight in the eye. "And Sam, we didn't hire you to clean the 3rd floor. We specifically told you in your contract to stay on the 1st floor. And more importantly, the power to the elevators was cut off 2 years ago. The cables were completely removed." Sam stood there, frozen in terror, as the realization washed over him like ice water. If the elevator didn't have power, and if the cables were gone, what had just carried him down from the 3rd floor? And more terrifyingly, what had been inside that shaft with him while he descended in the dark? Sam walked out of that office and never spoke of St. Jude's Hospital again. He took a job at a daylight landscaping company instead, working strictly under the bright sun. So next time you're scrolling through job listings late at night and you see a high-paying offer for a peaceful night shift in an empty, silent building, ask yourself a question. Is it really empty? Or are you just being paid to keep the company for whatever is still waiting inside? Stay safe out there. Keep your lights on and sleep well tonight, if you can. Hey again, welcome back to the channel. Before we start tonight's story, let me ask you a quick question. What is the absolute worst night job you could possibly take? Working the late shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere? Maybe cleaning empty hospital wards like we talked about before? Definitely creepy. But I think most of us agree that working overnight in a morgue takes the crown for the ultimate test of your sanity. I mean, think about it. You're literally surrounded by body bags, stainless steel tables, and cold storage units packed with people who were alive just hours before. Most people couldn't pay me $1 million to step inside a morgue at 3 a.m., but for a guy named Marcus, it was just another day at work, or so he thought. If you're listening to this right now in a quiet room, maybe turn on a lamp, double check your doors, and grab a warm drink, because this story is going to give you absolute chills. Marcus was 22 and working his way through a forensics degree. He was smart, practical, and extremely grounded in science. He didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or anything that went bump in the night. To him, the human body was just a complex machine. And when it stopped working, that was it. Game over, lights out. So when his university posted an opening for a night shift lab assistant at the county morgue, Marcus snapped it up immediately. The pay was incredible. It gave him real hands-on experience for his resume. And best of all, he figured he'd have hours of uninterrupted study time while monitoring the facility. His main job was simple: receive incoming bodies from paramedics or coroners, tag them, log them into the digital database, make sure the cold storage units remained at a steady 4 degrees Celsius, and keep the examination table sanitized. Easy money, right? No living people to annoy him, no customer service complaints, just peace and quiet. Or at least, that's what he promised his worried mom before heading out for his very first 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. When Marcus arrived at the facility, the day shift supervisor, a gray-haired veteran mortician named Arthur, gave him a brief tour. The facility was situated in the basement of an old municipal building. It smelled strongly of harsh industrial disinfectant, formaldehyde, and a lingering metallic sharpness that Marcus couldn't quite place. Arthur showed him the front desk, the main examination room with its gleaming silver tables, and the massive, thick steel door that led into the cold storage vault. Before Arthur grabbed his jacket to leave, he turned to Marcus with a strange, serious look on his face. He reached into his pocket and handed Marcus a small silver bell, the kind you'd see at a hotel front desk. Marcus kind of laughed, asking if that was in case a customer wanted to check in. Arthur didn't smile. He told Marcus that if he ever felt a sudden ice-cold draft when the cooling units weren't running, or if he heard footsteps coming from inside the locked cold vault, he shouldn't open the door. He told him to ring the bell 3 times, step back, and wait. Arthur said the sound frequency does something to calm down whatever energy settles in the room late at night. Marcus chuckled, assuming Arthur was just playing a classic prank on the new guy. Old morticians love scaring the rookies, right? Arthur didn't laugh along, though. He just squeezed Marcus's shoulder, told him to stay sharp, and locked the heavy security door behind him as he left. Suddenly, Marcus was completely alone in a basement full of dead bodies. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. Marcus sat at the metal desk, plugged in his laptop, and got to work reviewing his textbooks. The ambient noise of the basement was surprisingly comforting. Just the low, steady hum of the refrigeration units running behind the wall and the distant dripping of water. Somewhere down the corridor, around 1:15 a.m., the intake phone rang, giving Marcus a sudden jump. It was the local transport team bringing in a casualty from a highway accident. Marcus put on his heavy rubber apron, pulled on blue nitrile gloves, and met the paramedics at the loading bay. They wheeled in a long metal gurney wrapped in a thick black vinyl body bag. The paramedics looked exhausted, barely saying 2 words as Marcus signed the custody transfer papers. They handed him the clipboard, gave a weary nod, and drove away, leaving Marcus alone with the new arrival. Marcus wheeled the gurney into the main preparation room. Per standard procedure, he unzipped the bag halfway to verify the intake tag pinned to the toe of the body. Inside was an elderly man with pale, sunken cheeks and gray hair. Marcus double-checked the paperwork, logged the arrival time into the computer system, and assigned the body to locker 14 in the cold vault. Rolling the heavy gurney toward the steel vault door, he pulled the heavy latch down. The door unsealed with a loud hiss of releasing pressure, spilling a wave of freezing white mist over his boots. Marcus pushed the gurney inside, slid the body tray into locker 14, locked the door tight, and let out a sigh of relief. One down, 5 hours left to go. He felt proud of himself. He had handled it like a professional, totally unbothered by the macabre setting. He walked back to his desk, sat down, and returned to reading his textbook. But right around 2:45 a.m., the atmosphere in the room changed drastically. It started with the temperature. Marcus noticed his hands were getting stiff. He looked down and saw his own breath forming thick clouds in the air right in front of him. That was strange because the main desk area was supposed to be heated to room temperature. He looked up at the digital thermostat on the wall. The green numbers were rapidly ticking downward. 20 degrees, 15 degrees, 10 degrees, 5 degrees. Marcus stood up, rubbed his arms to warm himself, and walked over to the thermostat. Tapping the display, he assumed the heating control system was glitching out, but then the low, steady hum of the industrial refrigeration units completely shut off. The sudden, absolute silence in the basement was suffocating. It felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums like he was deep underwater. And that's when the sounds began. From inside the locked cold storage vault, Marcus heard a faint, rhythmic thud. He froze in his tracks. His eyes widened as he stared at the massive steel door. He held his breath, hoping it was just a pipe expanding or a heavy metal tray settling on its runner. But then it happened again. Thud, thud, thud. It wasn't random noise. It was the slow, deliberate sound of someone knocking on metal from the inside of a freezer locker. Now, let's pause for a second. Put yourself in Marcus's position. If you hear knocking coming from inside a room where only dead bodies are kept, what goes through your mind? The logical part of your brain says, oh my God, someone was mispronounced dead. They're alive in there and freezing to death. But the primal, instinctual part of your brain, part that keeps you alive in horror movies, screams at you to turn around and sprint for the nearest exit. Marcus was a science guy, so his medical training took over first. He thought someone had been brought in alive by mistake. Is someone in there? Marcus called out, his voice cracking slightly in the freezing room. Hold on, I'm coming. He rushed over to the steel vault door, grabbed the heavy metal latch, and yanked it open. The thick door swung wide, releasing a dense, icy fog that rolled out across the floor like smoke. Marcus stepped into the freezing vault, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Hello? Which locker are you in? He shouted. No answer. The knocking had completely stopped. The only sound was Marcus's own heavy, panicked breathing. He walked down the narrow central aisle between the long rows of steel lockers. He checked locker 14, the old man he had just put away. The lock was secure. He checked locker 12, locker 10, locker 8, nothing. Every locker was sealed tight. Marcus shook his head, running a hand over his face. He started to think his mind was playing tricks on him due to sleep deprivation and the creepy environment. He turned around to leave the vault. But as soon as he reached the doorway, a sound behind him made his blood run completely cold. It was the clear, distinct sound of a zipper. Swart, 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 swart. Marcus spun around, sweeping his flashlight beam back into the darkness of the vault. At the very back of the room, on an open prep table he hadn't noticed earlier, sat a long black body bag. The zipper was slowly, steadily sliding down all on its own. Marcus couldn't move. Fear locked his joints into stone. He watched in sheer horror as the black vinyl parted. From inside the bag, two pale, bloodless arms rose up into the cold air. The hands didn't move like a normal human's hands. The fingers twitched and bent backward at sickening, impossible angles, like spiders trying to walk. Then the body began to sit up, slowly, rigidly, the head tilted up toward the ceiling, revealing a face covered in heavy white autopsy stitches across the neck and forehead. Its eyes were open, completely wide, pitch black, with no whites or irises, staring straight at the ceiling. Then the mouth of the corpse opened. It didn't speak. It let out a deep, rattling, wet gasp, like a drowning person desperately inhaling air after being underwater for hours. Marcus let out a blood-curdling scream. All his scientific logic melted away into pure, raw panic. He scrambled backward out of the cold vault, tripping over his own boots and falling hard onto the slick concrete floor of the main prep room. He scrambled backward on his hands and knees, pushing himself away from the open vault door. Inside the vault, he could hear it. Drag, thud, drag, thud. Whatever was on that table had stepped down onto the floor and was moving toward the open doorway. Marcus backed up until his spine slammed into the leg of his wooden desk. He scrambled around wildly, looking for anything he could use as a weapon. A scalpel, a heavy clipboard, anything. And that's when his hand brushed against the small silver bell Arthur had left on the desk earlier. In that moment of absolute terror, Marcus didn't care how stupid or superstitious it seemed. He remembered Arthur's deadly serious warning. Ring the bell 3 times. Step back. Wait. With hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the metal object, Marcus grabbed the silver bell. He held it up in front of him like a shield. Ding! The sound resonated sharply through the silent room. At the threshold of the vault door, a dark, twisted silhouette paused in the rolling fog. Ding! The silhouette stiffened, its long, broken fingers twitching in the dim light. Ding! On the 3rd ring, a sudden pressure wave passed through the room like the sudden drop in air pressure before a violent thunderstorm. The freezing temperature in the room instantly snapped back to normal. The digital thermostat on the wall flickered back to life, glowing green. The industrial cooling units roared back to full power with a loud mechanical hum. And right before Marcus's eyes, the dense fog inside the vault evaporated into nothingness. The hallway was empty. There was no sound, no silhouette, no twitching hands. Marcus sat on the cold floor for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, holding the silver bell so tightly against his chest that his knuckles turned white. He didn't dare move. He didn't go back into the vault. He sat right there against the desk, his eyes wide open, watching that open steel door until the first rays of morning sunlight began to filter through the tiny, high-up security windows at 7 a.m. When Arthur walked into the building to start the morning shift, he found Marcus sitting on the floor in the exact same spot. Arthur took one look at Marcus's pale, sweat-streaked face, looked over at the open vault door, and then looked down at the silver bell still clutched in Marcus's hands. Arthur didn't ask a single question. He just knelt down, gently took the silver bell from Marcus's hand, and helped the young man to his feet. "You did good, kid," Arthur whispered quietly. "You did really good." Marcus walked out of that building, went straight to his university administrator, and changed his major to computer science that very afternoon. He never set foot in a hospital, a morgue, or a funeral home ever again. So, if you ever find yourself looking for a quiet night job, and someone offers you double pay to watch over a silent basement full of cold steel lockers, just remember Marcus's story. And if anyone ever offers you a silver bell for your desk, you better make sure you keep it within arm's reach. Thanks for listening tonight. Stay safe out there and try to get some sleep if your room stays warm enough. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we kick off tonight's story, let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever worked a night shift in a place so massive that you could go hours without seeing another human being? Maybe a huge retail store after hours, a giant distribution hub, or a massive industrial fulfillment center. There is something incredibly eerie about places that are designed for hundreds of bustling workers during the day, but become dead silent at night. You start hearing weird echoes, Shadows seem to stretch a little too far, and every little noise makes you jump. If you've ever had to walk down an aisle of towering shelves all by yourself at 3 a.m., tonight's story is going to hit way too close to home. Grab your favorite snack, lock your doors, make sure your room is nice and warm, and let's get into the chilling experience of a guy named David. David was 23 years old and desperately needed cash to pay off his college tuition when he stumbled across an online job posting for an overnight inventory scanner at a logistics hub on the outskirts of town. It felt like a total win. The job was simple. Walk through the endless rows of high-rack shelving, scan barcodes on stacked wooden pallets using a handheld laser device, and upload the data to the central system. The pay was nearly double the minimum wage because nobody else wanted to take the 11 o'clock p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. The warehouse itself was colossal, over 300,000 square feet of concrete floors, towering metal racks that reached up to 40 feet high, and millions of boxes wrapped in clear plastic. The company operated on a minimal overnight crew, meaning on any given night, there were only 3 people in the entire complex: the security guard at the front gate, a forklift driver named Pete, who stayed down in the shipping bay, and David, who had the entire main storage zone to himself. It was supposed to be easy money. You just throw on a pair of comfortable sneakers, put on a podcast, click your little red laser scanner, and watch the hours tick by. But as David learned the hard way, being alone in a massive building is fine until you realize you aren't actually alone at all. On a cold Tuesday night in November, David arrived for his 3rd week on the job. The air inside the warehouse was cold and drafty, smelling strongly of cardboard, wooden pallets, and motor oil. The overhead sodium vapor lights flickered with a dull, yellowish hum, casting long, dark shadows between the narrow aisles. David clocked in at the main terminal, grabbed his handheld scanner, put his headphones in, and headed straight for Sector D. Sector D was located at the very back of the facility. It was reserved for older stock, long-term storage, and surplus inventory that rarely got moved. Because it was so rarely visited, half the overhead lights in Sector D were burnt out or turned off to save electricity, leaving vast stretches of the tall metal shelves shrouded in deep, pitch-black shadows. For the first 3 hours of his shift, everything went completely smoothly. David moved down aisle 12, click scanning boxes, his handheld device emitting a satisfying beep every time a barcode registered. The rhythmic beep, beep, beep was almost hypnotizing. He was listening to a comedy podcast, chuckling quietly to himself, thinking about how easy this job was. By 2:30 a.m., he had cleared aisle 14 and turned the corner into aisle 15, which was notoriously dark and freezing cold. He pulled his hoodie tighter around his neck and took out one of his earbuds to hear if Pete was nearby on the forklift. Down at the far end of the facility, he could hear the faint, distant hum of Pete's forklift engine and the backup alarm going. Beep, beep, beep. Far away in zone, reassured that another human was in the building, David went back to work. He aimed his laser scanner at a large, shrink-wrapped pallet sitting on the 3rd shelf tier, about 15 feet off the ground. He pulled the trigger. Beep, but instead of the usual green light on his screen, indicating a successful log, the scanner screen flashed red and displayed an error. Message: unknown item, manual check required. David sighed, clicking his tongue. Manual checks meant he had to climb up the built-in metal rolling ladder attached to the shelving frame, locate the physical serial number printed on the back of the crate, and type it in manually. It was an annoying waste of time, but he had no choice. David pushed the heavy metal rolling ladder down the aisle, set the brake locks, and slowly climbed up to the 3rd tier. Up there, 15 feet above the concrete floor, the air was warmer, but the shadows felt much thicker. He pulled out his pocket flashlight, shone it into the dark gap between 2 massive wooden crates, and reached his hand into the dark gap between 2 massive wooden crates. narrow space to wipe off a layer of thick dust covering the serial plaque. As his fingers touched the cold metal tag, he heard a sound right behind him. It was a soft, wet sound, like a heavy, damp cloth being dropped onto the concrete floor down below. Thump! David froze. He held his breath, leaning against the cold metal railing of the ladder. "Pete?" David called out, his voice echoing through the long, narrow cavern of shelving. "Is that you down there, man? Did you drop something?" Silence. There was no engine sound, no footsteps, no answer, just the quiet hum of the distant fluorescent lights. David shook his head, telling himself a loose box must have slid off a lower shelf somewhere in the next aisle. It happens all the time in old warehouses, right? Wood shifts, cardboard softens, stuff falls. You've probably heard random noises in your own house at night. Blamed it on the house settling, just to help yourself go to sleep. That's exactly what David was doing. He quickly typed the serial number into his device, climbed back down the ladder, unlocked the brake, and kept moving down aisle 15. By 3:15 a.m., David was halfway down aisle 18, the very back wall of the entire warehouse. This area backed up against an old, abandoned rail spur that hadn't been used since the 1980s. It was dead silent down here. The air felt unnaturally thick, heavy, and freezing cold, making David's breath form faint clouds in front of his face. He aimed his scanner at a box on the ground level. Beep. Moved to the next box. Beep. Then, as he pointed his red laser line toward a dark corner near the bottom shelf of rack 42, the red beam hit something that made his heart instantly drop into his stomach. The red laser light didn't hit cardboard or plastic. It painted a bright red line across a pair of pale, bare human feet sticking out from underneath the bottom shelf. David gasped, jumping backwards so fast he hit his back against the shelf behind him, rattling heavy metal pipes overhead. "Holy crap!" he gasped, holding his flashlight up with shaking hands. "Hey, sir, are you okay?" He aimed the bright beam of light down at the base of rack 42, but when the light hit the floor, there was nothing there, just empty concrete, a few stray bits of packing foam and thick dust. David blinked rapidly, rubbing his eyes. He shined the beam around the dark corner, under the shelves, behind the wooden pallets. Nothing. He took a deep breath, clutching his chest as his heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He tried to laugh it off. He told himself he was just tired, that his brain was playing tricks on him in the dim light, creating illusions out of shadows and white foam packaging. "Get it together, David," he whispered to himself. 4 more hours. Just 4 more hours. He decided he needed a quick break to splash some cold water on his face. He turned around to walk back toward the main central walkway that led to the break room. But as he took his first step, he noticed something on the polished concrete floor in front of him. Leading down the center of aisle 18, straight toward where he was standing, was a line of wet, dusty footprints. Bare footprints. They were fresh. The moisture was still evaporating off the cold concrete in real time. And the worst part, the footprints didn't come from the main entrance of the aisle. They started right out of the dark. Narrow gap between 2 massive rows of shelving, a gap barely 6 inches wide. A space where no human body could possibly fit. Now, let's stop right here. If you were standing alone in a pitch-black, 300,000 square foot warehouse at 3 in the morning and you saw fresh, wet, bare footprints leading straight out of a 6-inch wall gap, what would you do? I don't know about you, but I would have dropped that scanner, vaulted over the nearest pallet, sprinted past security, and left my shoes behind if I had to. But David was paralyzed by a mixture of sheer terror and disbelief. He stared at the prints, his whole body trembling wildly. Suddenly, from directly above his head, high up on the topmost tier of rack 42, 40 feet in the air in complete darkness, came a sound that made David's blood turn to solid ice. It was the distinct, high-pitched click of his scanner device, followed by a soft, cheerful beep. David slowly, agonizingly tilted his flashlight beam upward. The beam traveled up the steel frame, up past the second tier, past the third tier, past the massive wooden crates on the fourth tier, all the way to the very top platform near the dark rafters of the ceiling. Standing up there, crouched on the narrow edge of a wooden pallet 40 feet above the ground, was a figure. It was horrifyingly thin. Its limbs were unnaturally long and bent at strange, jagged angles, like a human frame that had been broken and put back together completely wrong. It was wearing a filthy, tattered, high-visibility work vest over gray, pale skin that looked completely lifeless. Its face was turned toward the ceiling, but its neck was bent backward at a sickening 90-degree angle, allowing its dark, sunken, hollow eye sockets to look directly down at David. In its long, pale, twitching fingers, it was holding a secondary inventory scanner. David couldn't scream. His throat locked up, air refusing to enter his lungs. He just stood there, pinned to the floor by pure, unadulterated horror. The entity slowly tilted its head down further. The bones in its spine popped and cracked in the silence like dry branches snapping in a storm. It raised the scanner in its long fingers, pointed the red laser line down straight at David's forehead, and pulled the trigger. Beep! A wave of icy, unnatural cold washed over David's body. That sound broke his paralysis. David let out a primal, desperate shriek. He dropped his flashlight, turned around, and sprinted down the aisle as fast as his legs could carry him. He didn't care about the darkness. He didn't care about tripping over pallets. He just ran for his absolute life. Behind him, he heard a sickening, frantic noise. Clack, 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 clack. The thing was coming down from the 40-foot rack. It wasn't using the ladder. It was crawling down the vertical metal beams on all fours, moving with the terrifying speed of a giant spider, its long fingers and toes clicking against the steel frame with every movement. "Pete! Pete, help me!" David screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing wildly through the cavernous building. He burst out of Sector D into the main central cross aisle, his sneakers squeaking desperately against the floor. He could hear the metallic clack, clack, clack dropping from the ceiling onto the concrete right behind him, followed by the wet, slapping sound of bare, pale feet chasing him down the corridor. Slap, 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 slap. The sound was gaining on him at an impossible speed. David rounded the corner toward Zone A, practically throwing himself around the metal frame. Ahead of him, he saw the bright, beautiful yellow headlights of Pete's forklift. Pete was sitting in the driver's seat, wearing his high-vis jacket, preparing to lift a heavy crate. "Pete, run! Get out of here!" David screamed, sprinting straight toward the forklift and diving behind the heavy metal roll cage. Pete jumped in surprise, dropping his coffee cup onto the floor. "Whoa, David! What the hell is wrong with you, man? You scared the living crap out of me." David scrambled onto the footboard of the forklift, grabbing Pete's jacket, his face pale as paper, tears running down his cheeks. "There's something in Sector D. It crawled down the racks. It's right behind me. We have to go now." Pete looked confused, then annoyed. "What are you talking about? A squatter? A stray dog?" Pete picked up his heavy metal spotlight and shone it down the long, empty central aisle David had just run from. The long concrete hallway was completely empty. The yellow light cut through the gloom, illuminating nothing but silent, stacked pallets and empty floor. There was no noise, no footsteps, no pale figure, just the steady, low, idle hum of the forklift engine. "See, there's nothing there, kid," Pete said, sighing and shaking his head. "You're working too hard. The night shift gets to your head when you aren't used to it. Go to the break room, drink some water," and before Pete could finish his sentence, the central dispatch radio mounted on the dashboard of the forklift crackled to life. With loud static. Crackle, a voice came through the speaker. It wasn't the security guard at the front gate. It was a distorted, rhythmic sound. Beep, 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 followed by a low, dry, raspy whisper that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. "Sector D, Aisle 18. Item scanned. Manual check required. Pete froze. The annoyance vanished from his face, replaced by an instant, sickening, pale terror. He stared at the radio, then looked at David, then looked back down the long, dark corridor leading to Sector D. Without saying another single word, Pete slammed the forklift into reverse, backed out of the bay, turned the machine around, and drove both of them straight out of the open loading bay door into the cool night air of the parking lot. They didn't go back inside to grab their coats. They didn't clock out. They sat in Pete's truck at the edge of the property with the doors locked and the heater blasting until the morning shift. Manager arrived at 6:45 a.m. When they explained what happened to the regional operations manager, the company conducted a full security audit. They pulled the digital logs from the inventory system. According to the master server, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the precise moment David was being chased, someone in Sector D had manually logged 37 different obsolete inventory crates into the system. Crates that had belonged to a worker named Thomas, a night shift scanner who had tragically fallen from the 40-foot top tier of Rack 42 10 years prior, breaking his neck on impact. The company offered David a transfer to a daytime store location, but David resigned on the spot. He took a job working outdoors at a daylight garden center instead, where the ceilings are made of glass and the sun shines all day long. So, next time you order something online and it arrives at your doorstep in record time, just think about the massive dark warehouse where that box was picked and scanned in the middle of the night. And if you ever find yourself working graveyard shift in an empty distribution center and you hear a random beep coming from the dark rafters above your head, don't look up. Just drop your scanner, run for the exit, and don't ever turn back. Stay safe out there, keep your lights bright, and get some sleep tonight. If you're sure you're really alone,